Hi, so today we're going to talk about watercolor pencils and the final project in the mixed media course. So watercolor pencils are very interesting in that their delivery is super easy to use. So here's an example of a watercolor pencil painting. Sometimes we call them water-soluble pencils, and they've been available for many, many years, but a lot of artists just don't understand how versatile they are. You can use them exactly like you would watercolor, but you have a lot more control. And you can apply them wet or dry and wet with a brush. But they still retain some of the characteristics of regular colored pencils, like sharp lines and even texture. So if we look into the area of the peach here, you can see that some of the texture is allowed to stay there. So you can actually paint a layer and then come back over with the watercolor pencil and add more texture and leave that as is. So there's just an endless variety of ways that you can combine watercolor pencils, and we're going to be talking about that in this lecture. But the first thing I want to talk about is how you're going to think about your watercolor. And so in your content management system, the final exam is in multiple parts. So there's a graphite drawing that you will be responsible for, and that will be a drawing of composition of whatever it is that you're going to end up painting. So hopefully that's going to be a fruit or a vegetable. In addition to that, I want you to do two different color palettes, and you're going to do them in a sequence. And so in the first one, you're going to use the watercolors that I gave you, and you're going to start with yellow, and you're just going to take the same exact size brush, clean it off every time, and you're going to create right across the entire page of your watercolor paper that you had in your kit. You're going to create a rainbow stripe. So you're going to try to find the colors as best you can and go horizontally. The next thing you're going to do after you do the horizontal one is you're going to come back, turn it to its side, and you're going to do the exact same thing, except this time you're going to repeat it and you're going to do the same color in the same sequence, but you're going to go vertical. So you're going to go in the other direction, and you're going to look at what happens when you blend that same amount of color over the top of the existing colors. Now, one thing that's important to be successful is that you need to make sure that your underpainting is dry before you put the other color on top, number one. And number two, you need to have the same sort of consistency with water. So not too much water, not too little water. That's very, very important. When you're done, it should look something like this. So that we have gone all the way across, and you can see there like that cobalt blue. You can see how that was maybe too wet and how it actually saturated in and sort of scrubbed off some of the color that was underneath it. But what you're going to do is label your color chart. So you're going to label it, horizontally and vertically. You can use a big piece of paper to like put your drawing, your watercolors on, and then come back in and put in your labels. So when you're all completely done, it should look something like this, right? So there you have your cadmium red, your alizarin, your portrait pink, and so on. Okay, so it goes all the way through all your colors. The second part of the color chart project will be for you to create some sort of object, and then you're going to do some experimentation. So you'll notice that I have like a pumpkin there, and that I have some colors as to what I want those pumpkin colors to be when I'm done. So notice that I have a dark orange in the top, a lighter orange in the bottom, and then a green on the other side. So what I'm going to do is take and go across the color wheel, and I'm going to put the complement as an underglaze underneath in my original painting. So this is what it would look like. And then I'm going to go ahead and put in the next color. So you can see here that on the top, I started off with a teal, and I'm going to go to the darker orange. On the bottom, I have my brighter orange, so I started off with the blue, and then I came back over and put my orange over the top, which gave me the values that I needed from that darker blue. And then you can see as we move through each image between the underpainting and the finished painting, right? So that's something that I'd like you to do. Now you can do a little color wheel to help you next to your images, and I'd like you to try a couple different color combinations. So in this one, we just used blueberries, a cherry, and an olive. So you have to say to yourself, well, what color do I want to glaze? So the underpainting is the exact color, like in these particular problems. So rather than start with an opposite color, I'm starting with the same color that I want it to be, and then I'm putting like a pink over the top. So in the first one, you can see kind of how it turned out, that I put a pink over the top. And then the olive, I wanted it to be warmer, so there I put a yellow over the top of that green, right? So that would be another way for you to experiment as to what colors are going to go where, right? So in the middle of cherry, we started off with a blue, we added yellow for the highlights, and then came back in with over the top of our reds. And we had left the highlight blank. So when you're doing this kind of thing, you want to sit down and do kind of, what you want to, when you do these charts, I want you to kind of come up with like what works, what is working for you. So in this case, we took a lemon and we put the complement color first. And then in one of them, we put the analogous color. And in the last one, we put black, right? So we want to see when we put those as underglaze, like what is going to happen as an underbase, rather than go with a solid color and then put the other color on top. We want to see like, okay, what's going to happen if I start with that blue or that violet? And then we came back in and used the color that the lemon actually was. So there you can kind of see how it, and then we increased the amount of color and had a bigger color density as we went through. So see, there's your analogous. We're just coming back in with more of the yellows. So here's another one. This is in cherries. So there's our glaze versus our underpainting. So let's take a look at the differences here. So in the one, we started off with the underpainting in greens, and the other, greens and blues. And then in the other, we did a glaze made and put it over the top. So the difference is underpainting versus glaze. So there we can see in every object that we paint, we're always going to be looking for the same thing that we were looking for in drawing. We're always looking for the form, the reflected light, the cast shadow, and the highlight. Where's the light source? And so once we know that, when we look at our drawing, we know where it's going to be. We're going to follow that through all the fruit or all the flowers or petals or leaves or whatever it is that we're putting in. So in this case, we know that our highlight is going to be in this upper left. So now, how are we going to paint it? So we started off with the opposite of the color, like a little bit, an under painting of yellow, and then started to come in with our greens. And there you can see as we got darker, and then we also, continued to paint different, darkness levels and browns, so we came back in with our shadows and did browns. And then this is what we ended up with, right? So you always have to know where your light source is, where your highlight is, and where your cast shadow is. This is incredibly important. So as we go back to our original painting here, I want to talk a little bit about using the watercolor pencils, because so far everything that we've looked at was, kind of primarily watercolor, but, we can do the same thing with our watercolor pencil. So when you start your watercolor, you're going to, if you're going to start it with a watercolor pencil, you're going to start with layering the watercolor pencil with the colors you want to include. So in this case, if you're going to do an underpainting or whatever you're going to do, you can have that, first. So we've got the lighter green areas and some of the darker green areas. So if you notice the panel, like on this cube, the one that's like like looking towards the right is got different coloration than the one on the left versus the top. Then we come in with a brush and we literally paint. But how do we paint? We don't just go whoosh, whoosh, whoosh over the whole thing. Like in this case, we want to show that there's definite, it's a cube and that there's definite lines. So we're going to paint in a horizontal strokes, and we're going to paint each panel first, and we're going to let it dry, and then we're going to paint the next panel so that we don't have bleeding into the edges of the other panel. So that's how that would work. So let's take a look at an object. So this is a reference photo of an onion. So first thing we're going to do is take our watercolor pencil and we're going to draw an outline of the onion. We're going to show where our highlights are and any other particular kinds of things that we want to accentuate, like the kind of, edge where the onion had its leaves coming out on the top. Then we're going to come in with our watercolor pencil, and we're going to leave open those areas that we aren't, that we're going to paint more explicitly. So this is our underpainting. So we're going to pick the color that's going to be. So if we're going to use more than one color here, we can, or we can have it like lesser in some areas. Like you notice that there's a little brighter yellow up in the upper right corner and so on. And then we're going to add water. And so now that we've added water in our shadow, we can start to see how we still have some of the lines of the onion, but we don't have them all. We've diluted some of it, but some of it we still have there because we want to use those lines in the watercolor pencil as part of our texture. Then we're going to come back in and we're going to go with our watercolor pencil again, and we're going to deepen the yellow and deepen the red, but we're only going to do it, we're going to leave lines because we want to have that texture at the end. So we still have that little bit of light yellow showing through everywhere, but then we darkened those yellows and then put in our reds, right? So that's the way that would work. And that's our watercolor pencil that's gone over the first underpainting. The underpainting is dry now. So we wet it and now it's dry. And see how we're starting to get some texture and things happening up at the top of the onion and so on. Then we're going to wet those areas, and we're going to do them in circular strokes that go in between those lines. We're going to leave those lines intact as much as we can. There might be a little bleeding, but that's okay. But we're going to kind of carefully just swoosh the water right over the top and stop it where our highlights are, right? And the areas that we want to create more texture. Then we're going to add more color and add more water, and do this process until we get to our finished onion. And so this is our finished watercolor onion. And you can see it's really quite beautiful and really pulls in. So what you have to remember is when you're doing these paintings, that you have a little piece of scratch paper next to you, and that you're sitting down and you're saying, well, what am I going to put over what? Like, how do I want this image to look? And how am I going to make my shadows work? So am I going to use yellow over yellow, like in this case, like a gold over a brighter kind of yellow green, and then I've got my red, my cadmium red over the top. And it's good for you to label this stuff so that you remember it when you're actually painting multiples. So like in some of the paintings that you might do, there might be multiple flowers, and so you want to know what you used. And there you can see how different it is. So one thing that I want to talk about a little bit is the difference between using a light color and a dark color. So in this case, we're taking a blueberry and we're taking a light violet, and we're kind of adding in our shadows, right? So on the left-hand side, we've got the darker part of the berry that's not exposed to the light. On the right-hand side, the berry is light. And so we kind of came in and did our glaze over the top with that violet. On the right-hand picture, we used a darker violet, but notice that what starts happening is we start losing the kind of roundness of the shape. And then we kind of run into trouble because now we're saying, oh, maybe I need to take some of that off. So I'm going to use a little bit of water, and I'm going to pull out some of that color. And what happened to the top of the blueberry? We lose all the definition that we had, and it gets really messy. So light value, lay it on top quickly, don't scrub it. That's the do. The don't is dark values. You really got to be careful with dark values. You don't want to scrub and rework it, and you don't want to put too much water on the paper. Those are things you want to stay away from as you're doing this. Now, you certainly could go back in there with your colored pencil and try to recuperate, recoup what you had, the definition that you lost, but you can really see the difference there. So that's where you got to be careful of not going too far down the rabbit hole. In this case, we're taking an apple, and we've got our drawing, and we have our shadow drawing, and we're going to go with our steps. So this is a nice way to say, okay, what are my steps going to be when I paint this? So the first step is I'm going to do a yellow underpainting. Then I'm going to come back in with my lighter red, and then I'm going to come back in with my glazing, and I'm going to use red, a deeper red, a purple, and an even deeper red. And notice that as I go through, like there's my first one is my yellow, my second one you can see is that brighter red orange. The third one is where I'm going into those 3 darker colors. Look at the difference in those darker colors. And then I'm going to blend them as I move through and get into my last drawing, my last one, and that's going to be my darkest colors. So see how I'm very ginger about not getting too far with those dark colors, but when I do need them, which is where the penumbrum is, where the apple meets the shadow, see how nice that looks and how it really makes it separate from the background. So these are areas that after it's dry, you can come back in and lightly start to pull those colors. So here's a really nice kind of finished painting that this woman did, and there we can see it's of a lemon tree. And there you can see all her drawing is done. And in some cases, she even like washes over. So here's the first part where she's sort of saying, this is what my lemon's going to be, and this is where I'm going to keep my highlights on my lemon. So notice the lighter areas that are still there. And then she comes back in with a wash around the outside. Starts bringing in some of her darker colors. Notice that she waits for that wash to be dry. That wash has to be dry. Otherwise, it's going to bleed. So she wants that crisp edge of that lime, that kind of unripe. It's not really a lime, it's a lemon that's not ripe yet. And so she doesn't want that to go away. So notice that she's using, and also lighter colors in the foreground, darker colors in the background. So here we are, even getting further along, and this really beautiful wash. See that beautiful wash that she has everywhere? And that's because she did it early on, right? And then came back in and started to add her detail. And here we can see even more. And there's all of the detail. So a couple things to remember. You need to let things dry in between. You need to know what colors you're going to use before you use them. You need to preserve your white areas and your light areas. You need to know that. Now notice like in some of this, the style allowed for the lemon to bleed a little bit. So we see that bleed happening down by the lower right leaf and the lemon there. So, that might be an area that's going to get some more detail later on. Now, we haven't talked about using pen and ink, but after this would be all painted, that is when you would come back and actually add your micron pen if you're going to do that. You're not going to do it early on because you don't want to dilute that. You don't want to have that bleeding everywhere. So, this is definitely a process. Again, to remind you, you need to do those color charts in the beginning, and you'll get extra credit if you do one with your colored pencils, but I'm not requiring that. So I do want you to do one with your watercolor kit, and I want you to do the little samples where you're trying different colors, you're trying underglazes, and then you're trying glazes and underpaintings. And you want to be able to show the difference by putting little squares of the color and labeling what they are. And if you already know what you're going to do, originally I was going to give you a sample flower and have everyone do the same thing. I don't want to do that because I think that if you have an idea of a flower, this is your time to start practicing on that flower by doing those little experiments. And so you should have at least 5 different versions of ways that you could paint the same thing. Just like we showed with the analogous, the complementary, and the black. You could add a brown, you could add multiple colors of the, a split complementary. It just goes on and on. So we want to have at least 5 different versions of experiments of using different colors and having them next to each other so you can see what the outcome might be. I hope that helps. I'm very excited about this final project. I think it's going to be great, and that's all I've got for today.